Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Nock, and first of all, I want to apologize for being a little bit late with this video broadcast. If you could see our living room right now, it's more a more elaborate setting than they used to fake the moon landings. I can tell you that. So, in any event, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here and have this opportunity to interview Steve Hebrock about horse and hoof care today. For those who don't know Steve, he has an extremely varied and interesting background. For 19 years, he was a professor at Ohio State University and taught a variety of different subjects. For example, he taught computer-aided design classes, analog and digital electronic classes, technical drafting classes, introductory and advanced computer application classes, and one that I can actually understand what it was about. It was a university course on horseshoeing. Steve's also an active hoof care professional and a clinic and field instructor for Liberated Horsemanship. He's one of the very few people in the world who've actually attained the designation of Master Hoof Care Professional. He's also the author of the popular Enlightened Equine. It's a blog dedicated to promoting better horse and hoof care through the application of current research findings. He's also the president of Renaissance Technology, an engineering and consulting firm.
Right.
Which brings me to my first question.
Oh.
Steve, how has your background in engineering affected or influenced the way you trim hooves and your approach to hoof care?
Oh, that's an interesting first question. I guess I'm glad you asked that, because when I'm out giving a talk somewhere or even talking to one of our classes, I usually mention in passing that I'm an engineer, and nobody ever asks me any questions about that. They just, oh, okay. Once in a while, a client or somebody out in the field will say, oh, are you an EE, or are you a mechanical engineer? And so anyway, I'll try to give you a nice brief description of my life.
Drive a locomotive train?
Drive a train. I like to pull the whistle cord. Is my favorite part of that job. No, I actually started out studying music at the university. I went to music school in New York State. And long story short, I decided I didn't want to teach high school band the rest of my life. I went as a trombone player. And so I switched into music theory and composition. So I completed a degree in music theory and composition. And then I realized, well, I'm not going to make a living as a composer. So the school I attended was one of 3 schools at that time in the country who offered a 4-year degree, Bachelor of Science degree in sound recording. So we had a full recording studio there. And I entered that program, went through that program very rapidly. And along the way, and this is in the late 70s, I was asked to start teaching. So I started teaching electronics, both in the sound recording department to the sound recording majors, and in the physics department to the physics majors. And that was interesting start to my teaching experience, which I've continued, as you pointed out, to this day. But anyway, I realized I wasn't really wanting to make a living as a sound recording engineer, although I did do that for a while. My first job, I worked as a sound engineer, one of 3, at a place called the Chautauqua Institution in New York State. And I don't know if you've ever been to Chautauqua or know about that, but it's actually a town in western New York, near Jamestown, New York, it's over 100 years old, devoted to the arts, science, philosophy, and religion. And so they have about a 3-month season every summer where there are speakers from all over the world that come in to do everything from religious services to performances. So while I was there, I had the chance to do sound for Ella Fitzgerald, Tony Bennett, Sarah Vaughan. We had all kinds of people there. One of the first people I worked with was Jesse Jackson, for example, who was there to give a talk. Harry Chapin, Rita Coolidge, Helen Reddy. I mean, it was an interesting experience to work with these people face to face. After that, I was in graduate school at that point, and one of my former classmates, and was one of my students as well, had taken a job as an intern at a recording studio in Colorado, up in the mountains, and it's a very famous recording studio at the time. It was probably the premier recording studio in the world. It's called Caribou Ranch. And it was owned by a guy who was the producer of the group Chicago. So most of the Chicago albums were done at that facility before I got there. They had split up at that time. But so I was there as the chief engineer for about a year and a half, and working with albums for Chris Christopherson, Sheena Easton, Dan Fogelberg, Eddie Rabbitt, Amy Grant. You know, a lot of these people are dead now, unfortunately. But again, great opportunity to work with some really interesting people. And my job was the entire technical side of making a recording. Now, these people are paying just to use that facility. They're paying about $10,000 a day to use this facility. So anytime that something is not operational in the recording studio, the pressure is on me. This is pre-cell phone days, so when I would leave for the day, I had to call in frequently if we had a project in the studio to make sure things were running smoothly. Otherwise, I had to get back up the mountain. You know, I'd go down to Boulder and eat dinner or whatever, get back up the mountain and get into the recording studio and fix the problem. And I can say, in the time I was there, the studio was never out of operation for more than an hour and a half. And I'm pretty impressed by that, because you're fixing everything from, these days, this is pre-digital recording, so we're working on 2-inch wide analog tape. So tape machine goes down, this enormous mixing console goes down, microphones go down, whatever happens, I had to be able to fix very quickly under the pressure of usually a producer standing there looking at his watch.
Yeah.
So it was an interesting job, but I didn't like being around the recording business. I didn't like frankly, the drugs and the whores. Not my thing. And to be around that kind of lifestyle was very distasteful to me. So I was much more interested in designing products than using products. So I was offered a job at a company, small company called ADC, Audio Dynamics Corporation, in Connecticut, New Milford, Connecticut. And they made high-end and some less expensive phonograph cartridges. Again, something we don't have so many of anymore, right? Although they've come back. And some loudspeaker systems. So I worked there for a brief time. I was transferred down to their sister company, BSR. You might remember that name. They made many, many low-end turntables. BSR was around for a long time. Worked there for a few months, again in engineering, was transferred back to Connecticut, and now I'd moved to New York and spent what money I had to move there, and now I had a 2-hour-plus commute back to Connecticut every day, and I couldn't keep doing that. So I was offered a job at a company called Alltech Lansing. And Alltech Lansing at that time was not the people, we're not the people that make the little computer speakers. Alltech Lansing was one of the premier industrial professional loudspeaker manufacturers. And I was hired there as a quality control engineer, but specifically to design test systems for production testing. So, we made everything from, I don't think we did any home hi-fi kinds of speakers. We did these big enclosures that you see in commercial sound systems or in movie theaters behind the screen. These systems, we made airport loudspeakers, we made underwater, we made explosion-proof drivers for mining and oil rigs. So it was a very interesting business. I learned a lot doing that and developed several test systems. Most notably, I actually put the personal computer in the production setting and had it doing fast Fourier transform analysis, FFT analysis of loudspeakers for production testing. First person I know of to ever do that. So anyway, I was there for a couple of years and ended up being offered a job at a company in Ohio, a Japanese-owned company called Audio Technica. And I went there as an electronic design engineer and, again, developed all sorts of professional, mostly audio products. So one product in particular I'm really proud of was called an electronic news gathering mixer. So it was a small mixer that was designed to be used in the field, much like what we're doing here right now. But it was used by all the networks. So we would, the sales guy and I would go out to Turner Broadcast in Atlanta or NBC in New York, and we'd talk with their audio people there and explain the product to them and so on. So we sold a lot of that product. It was a good thing. Earned a couple of patents along the way in electronics for various aspects of that particular product's design. But I was in charge of, microphone design and loudspeaker design, and then I ended up being asked to design a line of hearing aids. The company, the president got interested in hearing aid development, so I designed a line of hearing aids. This is probably a lot longer answer than you wanted. Sorry about that. But it's nice to have a chance to talk about it. Anyway, I left there and started doing consulting and really broadened my horizons. Started incorporating what are called microcontrollers into products. A microcontroller, unlike a microprocessor, is a complete computer, including the memory, the input-output means, and so on, in a single chip, usually. And those are the kinds of things you find in your iPad or in your washing machine or your dishwasher, controlling that. So basically looking at sensor input, whatever that data might be, whether it's position information or a water level or light or temperature, and then making some decisions based on the state of those sensors. And so I was designing both the hardware and the software, doing projects for Panasonic Corporation, for SeaWorld of Ohio, did a really interesting whale communication system for them that involved 9 microcontrollers in these big underwater panels that the whales could interact with. U.S. Steel did work for them. Consumer Reports, I designed test equipment for them. And a lot of small companies as well along the way. So anyway, your question was, how does that influence my approach to hoof care? I think the whole point of all of that is that I was a troubleshooter, a problem solver. And so people came to me because they knew I could solve technical problems, sort of cut through the nonsense and see what's real. And in the hoof world, as I'm sure you can understand, that's very important. We have so much bad information in the hoof world about feet and how to take care of feet that I feel like it's really given me an advantage to be able to take a very analytical approach to these problem hooves and care for them in a reasonable and consistent way and solve their problems. Mm-hmm. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're a barefoot hoof care person,
right?
And I'm sure you've run into a lot of people who say, well, their horse can't go barefoot.
Yeah, yes.
Right?
Yeah,
And,
that's very common.
I mean, do you agree with that, that there are horses that can't go barefoot?
I think I don't agree with that. I think I know there are horses that are definitely not comfortable initially being barefoot. Unfortunately, most of the time, the people go right back to the shoes before they've given the horse an adjustment time. You know, if I ripped off my shoes and attempted to run down your stone-covered driveway, I'd be pretty sore. And horses who have largely grown up being shod and never had good ground contact for their feet, often, not always, but often they can be uncomfortable for a while on stones. Now, the solution to that is to boot the horse. So if you're doing something with the horse, riding the horse or something, we can put boots on a horse and really give the kind of protection that many people mistakenly assume a shoe provides. But a shoe doesn't really provide protection. It prevents excessive wear, and it raises the foot off the ground a little bit. It's a spacer rather than a protector, and a boot actually covers the bottom of the foot, the sole, and protects the foot. So yes, as Dr. Volk, Neil Volk, a guy we both know, faculty member of Liberated Horsemanship, said to me once, when people say to me, you know, well, my horse can't be barefoot, he would say, well, we've seen all of these horses, tens of thousands, if not more than that, all over the world who do what we do, and they are successfully barefoot. So really, horses can be barefoot, and you need to explain why your horse isn't like any of those horses. Why is it he's different? So I do believe they can all be barefoot. I do believe every horse is better off barefoot, even if there is some degree of discomfort for a while.
So there are two things that come to mind as you're talking about that. One, you clearly have an underlying assumption that barefoot is better. And second, you raised the question of why horses had shoes put on ever.
Right,
and
right.
So what do you say to those two things?
Well, in thinking they're better and in why they started shooting horses. You know, historically, if you can believe what you read in like Doug Butler's book on horseshoeing, considered the Bible of horseshoeing, horseshoes came into prominence in the Middle Ages. And before that time, something was put on the bottom of the foot only if the horse were injured. It wasn't routinely applied. Nothing was routinely applied to the bottom of horses' feet. You know, the Mongols weren't tearing around invading wearing horseshoes. You know, it didn't happen. But in the Middle Ages, some interesting things happened. First of all, horses were, for the first time in history, moved into these colder, mostly wetter climates of Europe. And we know moisture is a problem for feet. Feet get soft and become more sensitive when they get soft. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing was that society actually divided in those days. Rather than all of the horses being kept out in big open pastures, they were put in confined areas by what we'll call the haves. You know, they're living in walled cities, standing in their own excrement now, while the have-nots were living outside the walls of the city, and their horses are still barefoot and running around in the big pastures. So the feet are getting bad, they're wet, they're standing in their own excrement. Urine in particular is hard on feet. And the horseshoe nail was invented. So they finally had a way to attach a shoe to a horse's foot rather than tying things on, which is what they had been doing before. You know, the previous hoof care things looked more like slippers or gloves, if you want to think of it that way, or sandals. They're tied on. So the horseshoe nail, the wetter environment, and the fact that they were being kept stabled now, all led people to start putting shoes on their horses as a matter of routine. Why do I think it's better to have bare feet? Well, because, first of all, as far as I know, no horse has ever been born wearing shoes. I think that's a fairly safe assumption that no horse has been born wearing shoes. The hoof is designed to absorb shock and to promote circulation and to give some proprioception, meaning sensing or feeling the environment. And when we shoe the horse, we essentially short circuit those functions. But because the foot is basically clamped to a rigid piece of steel or aluminum, the foot cannot flex. And that flexing is a very important part of circulation in the horse's foot. In fact, it's really the only means of providing blood circulation to the foot, in and out of the foot. If the shoe is on, they can't sense the ground as well, because although there are no nerves down there at in the hoof wall, up at the coronet band, there are nerves around there, and that vibration or touch is transmitted up the rigid wall to those nerve cells, so they can feel with their feet. And there was a third thing I said there too, which I don't remember what it was, but that's okay.
Has there ever been any studies showing that the vibration caused by shoes actually deadens the sensory neurons around the hoof?
That's a great question. That's a great question. There has been some research showing without doubt that a shoe increases the impact forces on the leg. So putting a shoe on a horse does not cushion the horse more. And I hear this once in a while. People will say, well, putting a shoe on it absorbs shock. No, it doesn't. If you have this rigid piece of steel, it rings like a bell. And so the frequency of vibration increases as well as the magnitude or amplitude of vibration. What there have been, tangential but directly related to what you're saying, are studies on human beings in vibration for people who work with vibratory kinds of tools, jackhammers or sanders, drills, anything that produces vibration in the hands. And there's actually a symptom called HAVS, hand-arm vibration syndrome, where the hands can turn white. There's reports of a loss of sensation, numbing of the nerves, and things like that. And so it occurs to me, if that happens in a human from excessive vibration, why is it unreasonable or illogical to think that similar effects happen in the horse who is experiencing that vibration with every step that horse takes?
And in slow motion videos, that difference between the vibration that a barefoot horse experiences and a shod horse experiences is really dramatic.
It's shocking how dramatic. You can actually watch the shock wave travel up the leg when those shod feet come down, particularly if they're not landing properly, meaning a nice flat, even landing. If they're slapping the foot down either heel first or toe first, there's a very pronounced shock wave, not only moving up the leg, but actually causing eventual internal damage to the foot as well.
Yeah. So you think that horses, the hoof should land flat, not heel first or toe first?
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason I think that is because after observing hours of videos of feral horses in their aboriginal environments, meaning that dry, very rough terrain of parts of Australia or parts of the U.S. Great Basin, they all land flat. And when you stop and think about this, it's only logical. If I have I can use this as an example. If I take a foot and I drop it on a belt sander like this repeatedly, well, this is going to start to wear off and flatten out. So at some point, it's going to be a flat landing. Wear just naturally creates a flat landing.
Explain that a little bit in more detail, because that's an important point.
About why that happens?
Why wear eventually has to end up with a flat landing.
Well, whatever is long on the foot will make ground contact first, whatever is longer than the other part of the foot. And when it makes that contact on the rough ground, there's some abrasion there, some wear. Eventually, it will all wear to a nice even surface. It has to, and this is what we see with the feral horses. There was some work done by Doctors Hampson and Pollitt in Australia at the University of Queensland, where they would take a feral horse living in some of the wetter climate of Australia, which I hasten to say is not the aboriginal environment of the horse. And they would transplant the horse to the drier, much more aboriginal environment-like conditions. And sure enough, that horse gets worn, that hoof gets worn to be a nice flat foot. When they take the horse and put it back, it grows long heels and ragged feet and, you know, the typical mess we see of feet in wetter climates.
Yeah. So as the hoof grows, and does the toe get long and need to be cut back, or what happens there?
The usual pattern we see with horses, with domestic horses, because they're domestic horses and not experiencing the approximately 12 miles per day of movement of a feral horse in an aboriginal environment, is that they will experience, first of all, the wall grows at a uniform rate, front to back. But what happens is, because of breaking over, you see more wear at the toe than you do at the heels. Consequently, the foot, if you want to think of it like that, is the angle is getting steeper as you get longer between trims, because the heel growth is remaining pretty well unchecked, unworn, while the toe is getting some wear. So the angle is always increasing a bit. So commonly in wetter parts of the country, which is most of the country, I would say, we're going in and mostly taking material off the heels to restore that proper landing.
So then you take that horse with the long heels and put them on a dry, flat surface, and how does it land?
It lands heel first. Absolutely. Right. The reason, yeah, and that's a great point. I'm glad you're bringing this up. Actually, let me show you something here. Dora, my lovely assistant over here. Let's see if this is working. Yeah, is that okay? All right. Now, this is turned off, so maybe it's not working.
Not so.
Oh, is it the sync program?
Yes.
Okay, it just turned off.
I can probably explain it without it.
Well, what do I need to do? It's back up.
Do you see the brown screen yet?
No, I don't know how to get to that.
All right. Excuse me 1 second. While I
Just quit like a minute ago.
While I help her with this. Oh, yeah, we need to get me to the desktop. All right, thank you. There.
By the way, while he's doing that, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to write them on Facebook, and we'll try to get to them if they're not too harsh or anything.
Well,
Is it the desktop picture?
no, it's not. It should be here. and it should be right.
So while we're having this commercial break, I should mention that we had to cancel the Gateway clinics this year because of the COVID, and but it looks very positive for having them in 2021. We've had contact with the Ohio State ATI, where we've done the clinics here in the United States, and they think that it's going to be possible, and we'll get a final answer on that later. I put a post up today about it, so anyway, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was just filling time.
I appreciate that, Bruce. I'm no artist, but I'm going to give this a shot here. So here is a nice worn hoof here. Yeah. And when this hoof in the aboriginal environment makes ground contact, it lands evenly. And I'm sorry if that, I didn't draw my line quite right there. However, when you have less abrasive soil, as I mentioned, that heel growth is unchecked a bit, so the hoof tends to do this more, where you have heels like this, and you can see that the heels are longer here, but they're cutting into the softer terrain when the horse lands. Here's the important thing. It's not so much a flat landing. What it is the coffin bone inside, and I'll just draw a little coffin bone here, and a navicular bone back here, badly proportioned, and remember that the deep flexor tendon wraps around that navicular bone and inserts into the bottom center of the coffin bone. So that tendon is responsible for tipping the foot back. When the foot hits the ground heel first or toe first, there's a lot of very rapid acceleration of that tendon across the navicular bone. It's slipping very quickly, and that friction causes wear on the bone and damage to the tendon, and you eventually end up with navicular disease. Now, what happens, why so many people think horses land flat, is when you take this horse on the right and you take him into that flat surface in the stable, in the laboratory, wherever you're evaluating it, yes, he lands heel first because the heel is long and it can't cut into that terrain. But in his environment, whatever his environment is, if you were to measure the acceleration of the coffin bone, in other words, is that making nice even contact and not moving, you'll find that it's not moving. Doesn't matter if he grew up in the sandy soil, or wetter soil, and the foot is penetrating the ground, as long as he's on that surface, he's fine. He's landing correctly. But when I bring him in my arena with packed dirt or onto a road or something, he's landing heel first. Therein lies the problem.
So if for a horse to be able to
Thanks,
go
Dora.
Safely and without causing himself internal harm in the foot, he needs to have a configuration on the bottom of the hoof that allows him to land flat on a hard surface.
Yes, because the great thing when you think about this a little bit is what hoof form allows the horse to have no acceleration of the coffin bone on any surface. It's that one. It's the feral horse in the aboriginal environment trim job. And that's why we model what we do after that trimming. Because you can take that horse anywhere and he lands properly. That's the whole deal right there.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and the thing that really turned the light on for me with this was the work of Dr. James Rooney, the equine pathologist who did so many necropsies on horses looking at navicular disease. He actually did some experiments where he was able to duplicate the damage to the tendon through artificial friction on the tendon. He'd use heat lamps and he could get the same kinds of discoloration in the tendon that he would see in horses that have damage at that deep flexor tendon navicular bone interface. And as he says, it's an arthrosis, just like when your hip goes bad or your knee goes bad. And I guess I ought to take the chance to say that if a horse actually has that kind of damage, like your hip, they're not giving you a supplement to fix your hip. You need to replace it. Unfortunately, we're not at that point with the horse. So when a horse actually has navicular disease, that's a dead end. The best we can do, even for that horse, and I've done this with several horses, give them that flat landing and they are the most comfortable they can be.
And the sooner they get that, the more unlikely
Correct.
it is that they'll develop navicular disease.
Absolutely. The scary thing, one of the most disturbing things for me about the hoof world is that the universal advice, well, I'm just going to tell you the scenario. The farrier typically leaves the heels too long. The horse goes out and works on some harder terrain. He's heel sore. The vet comes out, says the horse has navicular, right? What does the vet tell universally to do?
Raise the heel.
Raise the heels, wedge the heels, put a pad, wedge pad in there. And that's exactly the thing that will cause the damage. So their solution, taken to the extreme, meaning years of this, will actually cause the very problem they're purporting to try to fix.
So that they're thinking that by raising the heels, they're taking pressure off of the navicular bone.
Yeah.
And in fact, what they're doing is they're increasing the friction.
Correct. In the static sense, they are taking pressure off the navicular bone a bit. But in the dynamic sense, unless your horse is standing all the time, he's moving around, and with every footfall, he's going whap, whap, whap. That rapid acceleration across the navicular bone is causing damage.
So it's always seemed to me that horse owners should be knowledgeable enough about the hoof to be able to look at it and tell things about how whether the hoof is in a good shape for the horse, whether there's something in the horse's lifestyle that is causing problems, etc. What do you say about that?
Yes, I think that's very important. That's been the focus of a number of clinics I've had personally, although I don't do those anymore. Has been the focus of the classes I teach at the university still, the hoof care component of that, where we're not trying to turn these people into trimmers. We're trying to educate them as horse owners or maybe managers of horse facilities on how to recognize good hoof care. And certainly many of the people who attend our gateway clinics end up being just that. They maybe they want to trim, maybe they don't, but they become more aware of what it can do. So yes, what can we tell looking at a foot? Well, you can tell a lot about the horse's lifestyle in looking at the foot. So obviously we can look at it from a more superficial level and say the trimming job's not so good. But beyond that, what can we tell?
Which it seems to me that if you're a horse owner, you should be able to look at your horse's hoof and just have at least an educated idea about whether your trimmer or farrier is doing a decent job in that regard. But most people, they don't have a clue about what to look at to know if that's true.
You're right, yeah. Just a few things you can look at, even from the top, we'll say. The tubules, the lines that run through the hoof capsule, those should be straight. They shouldn't be wavy or squiggly. They should be straight. The hairline of the coronet should be very even and not shoved up in places. And you can see that quite obviously when you, and it should be level, when you get to looking at the foot. There shouldn't be any flaring out back in the heel area, no underrun heels where the heel buttresses actually bend under the foot.
Can you explain that more? Because that's an important
The
concept.
flare, the whole thing?
The underrun heels. I think most horse owners don't have a clue what that means or how to tell if it's there.
Well, there are a couple of different definitions for underrun heels. One of those is, Dora, how about if you put me back on the drawing? Am I good? All right. One definition is that when the front of the foot and the back of the foot, you have an angle like this, and I've exaggerated this some, where the tubules are like this. They're converging at some imaginary point down here, rather than the opposite kind of shape where you imagine a cone this way. It's an inverted shape. Mm-hmm. But mostly when I talk about underrun heels, the hoof comes down, it comes to the back, and the heel buttresses, now how am I going to draw these? Squished forward. I know how I'll do it. So when you look at the lines look good, the tubules. When you get back here, they're bent like this. This is a clear sign that the heels have been left chronically too long, and the hoof has deformed itself in that constant pounding down of the heels first on the ground. The heels can go one of a couple directions. They can either bend out to the sides in what we call flaring, but on occasion they'll actually bend under the foot. And so we'll get to this horse and the owner will say, oh, my horse has no heels. He has no heels. No, they're actually very long. They're just bent under.
And when the hoof grows, it essentially grows down and forward.
Correct.
Which puts the heels at the wrong place under the horse's leg, right?
That's it. Dora, are we still on the drawing screen? Or can we get back to the... Okay. Yeah, one of the interesting things about that is as the foot grows, you guys are going to get sick of looking at my really lame drawings here. As the foot grows, it's growing this way and this way, at front and back. And so you can think of it as the entire footprint of the horse has moved forward. Now, from a mechanical standpoint, because the base of support, which was supposed to be back here somewhere, has moved forward, you're putting more strain. You've got this big lever up here to the fetlock, and you're putting more strain on the horse because remember, the suspensory apparatus up in here absorbs all of that. And so by standing him out on stilts at an angle, you're causing stress on your horse's suspensory apparatus.
And so at the same time, what people see is that as the hoof gets too long and it grows down and forward, rather than seeing where the heels are going, what they see is the toe is too long.
Yeah.
And so they cut the toe off.
Yeah.
And that doesn't solve the problem because the heel is still at the wrong place. So what's the solution?
Well, trim the foot correctly. But one of the things we encounter very frequently when we're out talking and somebody has the vet come in or the horse, the barn owner comes in, and we hear all the time, oh, the toe on that horse is too long. That's not right. And it's an interesting thing because, first of all, we always trim toes to be as short as they can be without violating any sensitive tissue. So you can't trim safely any more off the toe than we're trimming. But here's the whole reason for that. They're used to looking at feet. Can you go back to drawing, Dora?
Yep.
They're used to looking at feet that the farrier has left the heels long on and they're very upright, like this. When we get those heels down to where they belong, and I'll just go from the toe back, and we get those heels down, this same length now is at a steeper angle like this, and that, it's an illusion. If I took a ruler and I measured from there to there on that foot before I trimmed it, and from there to there on that foot after I trimmed it, it's not any longer. It's just at a lower angle. And people say, oh, that's not right. Here's the interesting thing. When they x-ray these feet, the coffin bone, the joints, all line up great. Years ago, I hadn't been in private practice too long at that point, meaning trimming for a lot of other people. I had a client say that her vet had been over, and the vet said, oh, those heels are too low. It's either the heels are too low, the toes too long, or both. Those heels are too low. And then she x-rays the foot, and she says, well, the coffin bone's in exactly the right position. Everything lines up perfectly, but those heels are too low. Well, both can't be true, you know? A lot of times veterinarians don't recognize the angle between the bottom of the coffin bone and the ground level should be very, very shallow. 3 to 6 degrees is usually the thing. And they'll quote that number to you, but they don't know what it looks like. I've actually taken x-rays and overlaid a protractor on the x-rays to show them, yes, in fact, that is 4 degrees. So they'll say, oh no, the heels are way too long or too short. Well, they can't be because the coffin bone's at the right spot. The bones of the leg line up properly.
Right.
And that's a particular issue, with the laminitic horse. You know, those feet can look all kinds of wacky. But let's get back to the other question you asked about what can the horse owner see? So they should be able to tell if things are in balance because when they watch and especially listen to the horse, they should hear a nice, distinct sound when the foot makes ground contact. Not a smeared sound, not a double tap, meaning a really long heel or a really long toe. When you look at the bottom of the foot, you should see a nice tight white line. The white line, of course, is the junction tissue where the sensitive lamina attached to the coffin bone and the insensitive lamina on the inside of the hoof wall, they interlock and form the white line. And it shouldn't be stretched. It should be a very narrow and consistent width all the way around the foot. When you see it stretched, there's something going on. Worse, you see a loss of concavity in the bottom of the foot. If the foot is very shallow, you have to suspect something is wrong. And the something that's wrong is not with the trimming. The something that's wrong is the diet of the horse almost 100% of the time. We'll go in and look at a horse and we'll say, this horse is obese. And we can see on the bottom of the foot that this horse is headed into laminitis. It's very clear. And this condition is what I like to call subclinical laminitis because the vet will never recognize this as laminitis. They'll say that horse doesn't have laminitis. But we can tell. We can see the stretching, the inevitable stretching coming in the white line and the loss of concavity because those lamina, those connections to the hoof wall have started to break down and the weight of the horse is pushing the sole flat. When we see that, it's time for the owner to take us seriously. We recently had a client that decided that she'd rather just put shoes on the horse. We said, the horse is too heavy, it's a problem, and she chose to just shoe the horse and ignore the problem.
So really, we've talked about Navicular disease and now laminitis, two of the major hoof problems that people face. And what you're saying essentially is they're both preventable.
Oh, absolutely. Navicular disease, to start with that one, is a 100% man-made condition. feral horses don't experience navicular disease because, first of all, we're not forcing them to run fast over something for long periods of time and have bad landings and have all that friction across the bone. So, yes, if the horse is trimmed properly and not forced to do activities that cause excessive length of time acceleration there across the navicular bone, they won't develop navicular disease. Laminitis is related to stressors, which you are an expert in, but stressors in the horse's life, it's a management issue. It's not a foot issue. You can't trim laminitis into a foot. No matter how many times you might hear a vet say that, you cannot create laminitis through trimming. You might make a horse who's on the verge of laminitis more sensitive because you've trimmed, but you can't create laminitis.
Well, and these are the reasons why in our Gateway Clinic we really spend half of the time talking about how lifestyle type things affect the foot rather than just spending time teaching people how to trim, which is also a major thing. But both of those components are extremely important to hoof care.
Extremely important. You know, if you sit and do a little math, what I came up with is roughly we spend, the trimmer or the farrier, whoever it is, spends a 20th% of the horse's life with the horse. A 20th%. What is it I can do in a 20th% of the time that will necessarily address every issue? I can talk to the owner about diet. I can talk to the owner about that dirty stall the horse is always standing in when I get there, but I can't make them do that. So yes, hoof care is important, but hoof care is a comprehensive thing. It's not just about trimming. It's about the lifestyle of the horse. Is a horse under stress? Is he by himself? No companion? Is he beside a horse that he can't stand, so he's pacing all the time? You know, stressors, as you know well, cause problems too.
Do you think that there are horses that are genetically compromised to go barefoot?
I think that there are some feet. I think that there are some feet that are less suitable for certain tasks being barefoot. Just barefoot in a pasture? No, I don't think so. But we do see horses. You know, a few years ago there was a trend to breed quarter horses to have these little tiny deer legs and little tiny deer feet. Well, if you got a tiny little foot and you're asking a lot of the horse, yeah, it's going to be more prone to problems than a bigger foot. But other than that, no. I think genetics plays a very small role in hoof health and function. Very small role. Conformation, movement, and what they move over, and then stressors and the diet. Those are the things that matter.
Right, and all of those types of things we now know have the potential to affect how the genes function through the epigenome.
Yeah.
So you know, it all comes back to, you know, what happens in the horse's life. You know, how it's trimmed, how it's ridden, how it's kept, whether it's kept in stalls or outside, etc., etc., etc. It all goes together. It's a whole horse kind of phenomenon.
Absolutely. The worst candidate, you know, if you want to talk about somebody taking their horse barefoot, the worst candidate for me is the person that calls you and says, "Oh, I heard about that barefoot thing. You know, can you do that? Can you do that like Clinton Anderson thing?" You know, it was back. You know, Pete was out at Clinton Anderson's place some years ago, and after that, I got all kinds of phone calls. Do you do that Clinton Anderson kind of trim thing?
Well, I was there.
Yeah, I know. I know you were there. So the problem is they don't understand what's going on, and you go in and you see a horse, an overweight horse. He's eating, 10 pounds of processed food a day, standing in a urine-laden stall all day, and they say, "Could you take the shoes off and do that trim thing, and then I want to take him on a 20-mile trail ride tomorrow." No, no, this is not going to be successful. Your horse is going to be miserable.
How long does the transition from shoes to barefoot really take, and what
Yes.
should you do to facilitate it?
Yes. The transition generally, I think, takes only a trim or two, a trim cycle or two. In other words, 6 to 12 weeks, and most horses are perfectly fine being barefoot. Are you talking about with using some boots or without using boots?
Well, I mean,
that's
it's
a
always
factor.
seemed to me that if someone's boarding their horse and all they do is ride in a sand arena,
Yeah.
that there is no reason under the circumstances to have shoes on. But if they're going to ride out on a trail with rocks
Yeah.
and things like that, it seems to me if they're barefoot, you have to take certain precautions.
Yeah, boot the horse. I mean, there's nothing wrong with boots. I hear quite often, they're too much trouble to put on. And I say, well, you got your horse out of the pasture, yeah, and you brushed him, yeah, and you put the saddle on, yeah, but you can't take another minute to put a pair of boots on the front end of the horse. And there are boots that go on so easily now compared to some other styles.
Yeah.
To me, that's just an excuse.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason that you would have to do that is because the hooves aren't conditioned to go out on those trails. If
Yes.
they were out on those trails all the time,
Yes.
those hooves would get conditioned to be out there.
Yes.
But if they're not, you need to put protection on them. Nobody's denying that. The people who say, I took my barefoot horse and I can ride him any place, that's just not true. That's a misrepresentation of the facts. There's a commitment that goes along with having a barefoot horse, but that commitment is rewarded because you have a way healthier horse.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. One of the most telling demonstrations that I have done with a number of clients is where you have that typical scenario where the horse is shod in the front and bare in the back. And in those, it's kind of entertaining almost to go to the back of the horse and pick up the foot and show them with the hoof knife, man, this stuff is hard. Go to the front, the shod, pick it up, and you can take your hoof pick and dig the sole out of the foot. It's that much softer. Why? Because there's no ground contact. Mm-hmm. When you and I were kids,
That's almost.
I know,
I
that's
can almost
like
remember
the
that
dark
long
ages.
ago.
Speaking of the dark ages, when we were kids, if we would misstep and sprain an ankle, the prevailing medical advice was keep your foot up for a few weeks, you'll be fine. And what they found was that while the ankle healed, you had a weak ankle. Why? Because they discovered that tissue's strength is proportional to the demands that are put on the tissue as it's regrowing. No demand, weak tissue. And I like to say that that's a very strong parallel with the feet. You're not asking anything of the foot because you've offloaded that task onto a horseshoe. You're going to have some pretty crappy feet. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are products you can use, products like Keratex. We use Keratex a lot with horses as we're transitioning them. Hoof Armor is another popular product. These are, Hoof Armor is a coating. Keratex is more of something that penetrates the sole material and forms a matrix with the sole material and toughens the sole. And they do help. So if you have a horse that's having a bit of trouble initially being barefoot, you can help them. It's like, you put a layer of duct tape on the bottom of your feet before you go out and run on the rocks barefoot for the first time. Yeah. So we can help them along. It's worth it, we lose very, very few clients who go back to shoes. It just doesn't happen. Once they see the lower cost of care, the happier horse. And another interesting thing that we've not touched on at all, I'm not a sophisticated rider and I don't pretend to be, but I have had people who are much better riders than me say, boy, I can really feel the difference in the movement quality of that horse now that you've gotten the shoes off him and trim the feet properly. He's moving so much more fluidly. He's not up on the forehand anymore like he was. Well, yeah, because those long heels tend to pitch the horse forward.
Sure.
Yeah. So there are benefits to your riding, not just to the care and the health of the horse.
Well, I mean, it only makes sense. I mean, think about it. If you have shoes on and you're markedly increasing that vibration that's going up the leg, it's going to make the horse move in a more stilted, restricted way, and that's going to be transmitted up to his stiffness, because he's not going to feel real good. And it all adds together. And if the horse is on, like that, and he's on his forehand, I mean, he's pounding those front feet, and you just can't. It's easy to understand why people put shoes on the front feet.
Sure.
Because the way they ride beats them up.
It does.
And so they end up putting shoes on. Yeah. But it requires a commitment. It requires a commitment to learn to take care of your horse's feet, diet, how you ride the horse. But, it's a lifelong interaction with an animal who, if you have them, you probably really love having them. And
exactly.
So, make the commitment to at least do the best you can do.
Absolutely.
That's all you have to do.
Yeah. I'm going to make a very strong statement here. We haven't talked about this at all, but, back when I started in this hoof care business, which has now been a long time. I started this in 93. There weren't other schools of thought. It was kind of, you shoe the horse or you do what Jamie Jackson was teaching at the time, or maybe Hiltrud Strasser. But it wasn't like it is now. And I want to say, and some people will probably be upset by this statement, there's only one correct way to trim a horse. It's not how I trim the horse. It's not how you trim the horse, or how Dora trims, or how anybody. It's how nature trims the horse. That is our standard. And I believe we do the closest job possible to that. But there's only one right. When I hear these people say, I'm in this school of thought and we use this style, and that's all baloney. I'm sorry. That's all baloney.
And to just clarify that, it's how nature trims the hoof when the horse is living under the aboriginal conditions that it evolved to live in.
Absolutely. That's an important, part of that whole thing. I know there are a number of schools out there or people teaching trimming, and they say, well, we use a little different style, and we do this, and maybe we draw lines on the foot, or we use a hose clamp to show us where to trim. Sorry, that's all nonsense. If you understand how nature trims under those circumstances, and you understand the tissue of the horse's foot, you will never go wrong trimming a foot, any foot.
Again, to clarify, you're not saying that you have to trim the foot to a specific shape.
Oh, no. The tissue guides you on how to trim that horse at that particular moment in time. I like to say, I'll give you an example I've never used anywhere. Dora and I just got done watching a whole lot of seasons of a show called The Yorkshire Vet. And the Yorkshire Vet is a vet practice who actually took over James Herriot, the author's practice up in Yorkshire. And so we've watched hundreds of surgeries on animals now, 9 seasons, I think it is, 8 or 9 seasons of this show. Hundreds of surgeries. Not one time did the surgeon say, let me get the tape measure. I got to measure from the hip so I know how far away from the hip it is to get to the stomach. Or let me measure down from the elbow. I need to know. They don't do that. They say it's about here, let's cut here, and I got to find it in there. They're looking at the tissue. We look at the tissue of the foot. It's the only guide, not numbers. Nature doesn't trim to numbers. You know about bell curves, normal distribution. Yep. You can't use numbers to trim something that's Could be here, could be there, could be here. You can't do it.
So you can't put a device on it and trim
No.
around the
No.
perimeter of the device.
No. I'm convinced that so many of these groups, these factions have sprung up because they entice people into believing that there's a quick way to trim feet. And they don't have any higher success rates than farriers do at doing it, which I think is, according to Dr. Deb Bennett, as I recall, it's around 84% or something, she says. They're successful 84% of the time. Why? For exactly the reason I'm saying. They don't understand the foot. They're trimming to a pattern, a method, not to that specific foot's tissue at that moment in time. Yeah. Sorry for those. That's Dora asking Paisley to stay out of the picture here.
Dog intrusion.
Dog intrusion, yeah.
Well, I think that's a good place to call it quits. What do you think? Are there any
I
questions?
think that sounds
Dora,
good.
there are
Doris.
Let's hear them.
The first question is, have you heard about distal descent?
No, I guess I assume that means the coffin bone is descending in the foot, but no, I'm not familiar with that phrase. So if you want to clarify, I'll try to talk more about it.
Jeanette who asked this question, so if you could elaborate on that. But Jeanette also says, I have my horses on boots on all fours 24/7 with a 2-hour stall break for them off and switch the boots out twice a day. Their feet have never looked better and they prance. Equine Fusion jogging boots are the best.
Jeanette, I'm curious about why you would have horses in boots all the time. No hoof boot is designed to be worn 24 hours a day. It's moisture builds up in there and you end up with soft feet and possibly thrush or bacterial infection. So I would be concerned about that. Is there a reason that you feel like they need to be booted all the time?
Yeah, potentially it could slow the adaptation of the hoof to the terrain. And,
yeah. But thanks for commenting. I appreciate that.
Yeah, so maybe Jeanette can comment, but there is a bit of a delay, so let's
that's
move on
fine.
to the next. This is Stacy saying, for a horse with navicular and coffin rotation. I don't know why both, because I've never
That's
heard
interesting.
both of those at the same time.
Right.
Would boots be an option with some type of wedge for support?
Yes. Stacy, I don't know at what point you wrote that question, but wedges are exactly the wrong thing you want to do in the case of navicular disease for the reasons that we've talked about. Now, we do need to distinguish here. When you say navicular, do you just mean caudal foot pain? Undiagnosed reason for pain in the back of the foot? Or has there actually been an MRI, not an X-ray, but an MRI to diagnose true navicular disease?
Because, as you said before, Dr. Rooney really has specified certain things, and you can exclude navicular from a whole bunch of horses where it actually gets diagnosed.
Yes. Yeah, we didn't get into all that, but yes, there are a lot of reasons why I believe navicular disease is the most overdiagnosed condition. In all the years I've been trimming horses, I've only seen, I think, 2 or 3 cases where I honestly believe the horse had navicular disease. Every other case of navicular or navicular disease was not that. It was almost always another problem, most often a frog infection, actually. But when the vet doesn't recognize that frog infection, they write it off as navicular, just meaning syndrome, It's got heel pain, but we don't know why. And here come the wedges. And you really don't want to wedge up a foot ever. It's just not the right thing to do. I don't know if you want me to talk for a minute about the veterinarian's education. It's kind of an interesting thing.
Sure, why not?
Well,
this is your night.
This is my night, all right. Well, I've been looking. First of all, I hear some really screwy things from vets. And usually it's second hand or third hand, you know, that the vet says it's this. And most of the time they're wrong. One of my most interesting vet-based experiences, I was riding, and it wasn't about feet, I was riding my horse inside years ago. And a woman came in through the door on her horse, and my horse spooked a bit. And she explained to me that the reason that the horse spooks is because of the way their vision works, and that they actually see things as being bigger than they actually are. Yeah. Now, Bruce is already laughing over here. I said to her, I'm sorry, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. You don't have to think very long about that to realize that makes no sense. How can something be bigger, look bigger than it actually is? That doesn't make any sense, because our entire frame of reference is what we see. So anyway, she said, no, a veterinarian, I saw that in so-and-so magazine. Well, I didn't believe her. I thought she misread it. I went and got the magazine. Sure enough, here's an article by a veterinarian saying horses' vision works this way, that they see things as being bigger than they actually are. Now, I'm sorry, that's a veterinarian who has no business talking about optics, because she clearly doesn't understand how vision works. You know, when you look at, and I just did this recently, when you look at the education background of veterinarians, and all you have to do that, it's very simple. There aren't that many vet schools in the country. By the way, I'm talking about the U.S. I can't speak to Europe or anywhere else in the world. But all of their courses are listed online. All you have to do is get online, go to the vet school's website, and look at the course offerings. Do you realize that most every school I looked at, and I looked at the top vet schools, they don't offer any courses in the equine hoof, nothing. I know that my former employer, without trying to go out too far on a limb here with what I say, you know, I questioned them at the vet school about that, and they said, yeah, we don't teach anything about the equine foot. You know, we have a farrier come in and talk for a bit, but that's it. That is the sum total of most veterinarians' experiences. Look it up. No courses in the equine hoof in vet programs. So why are vets out telling everybody this is how it is? That's how it is. Well, that's a good question. What I've found is if you go to a small animal vet who has no stake in telling you the truth about their study, and you ask them, what did you learn in vet school about the equine foot? They'll say, well, I learned the parts of the foot, and maybe, like Neil Volk will say, I learned that if you have this condition, you put that shoe on, and if you have that condition, you put this other kind of shoe on. That's all they've learned. Some of them will just say nothing, just like that. Mm-hmm. So we want to trust our veterinarians about feet. Unfortunately, they don't know about feet. And that, I'm not saying it to be mean. I'm saying look at their courses of study. There is nothing there about the equine foot. So be very cautious about trusting any veterinarian about what they say about feet, because probably they don't know.
Yeah, it's very hard to find authentic information anymore.
Oh,
and
yeah.
In defense of horse owners, they don't have any frame of reference to actually judge who has authentic information
Absolutely.
and who doesn't.
Absolutely.
So the natural thing to do is to look toward people with degrees.
Yeah.
And I can tell you from personal experience that degrees don't make you an expert in everything. Your education is channeled towards certain things and encompasses certain things. It doesn't encompass everything. And so, but it's a challenge for horse owners to find authentic information about hoof care.
Absolutely. And you know, when I get a consultation from some other part of the country and they ask me for, you know, who can I go to help me with the horse, I really don't know what to tell you. It's very difficult, which is why I end up doing online consultation and encouraging people to come to our clinic, so at least they can recognize, if nothing else, they'll leave there recognizing what a good foot looks like. and what a bad foot looks like, and know how to trim a normal foot.
Yeah,
you know,
a horse owner, it costs some money to come to our clinics.
Well,
They're not
sure.
cheap. They're a week long.
Yeah.
It includes, most of them anyway, the housing and transportation and food and those kinds of things. But it's not cheap. But when you break it down in that you might be prolonging your horse's life, prolonging its useful years, it's really a small investment.
Absolutely.
To make. So
Absolutely.
sometimes you just have to bite the bullet. Horses, they're expensive, no question about it.
Right.
And I can say that from personal experience as well. So,
Yeah.
well, I think that's a good place to end in this. Is there
more
any
questions?
There are more. There
more?
are
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Stacy, sorry. Stacy also commented, and he will not grow heel. We've tried different ways, but long toe and no heel, very little sole. And she also said that was done by X-ray, not MRI.
The navicular?
The navicular.
Oh, yeah. Stacy, unless the horse has advanced navicular disease, according to Dr. Rooney, you cannot diagnose it on X-ray, even though veterinarians do this all the time. They see little holes, little invaginations in the navicular bone. They call them lollipops or different words like that. And they say, well, there's navicular. Those things are not, I repeat, not signs of navicular disease. Navicular disease is specific damage to the face of the navicular bone where the deep flexor tendon crosses it. Anything else on the navicular bone got nothing to do with the navicular disease. Second of all, when you say no heels, there's this prevailing idea among a lot of horse owners that horses need heels. Yeah, they got to have heels. His heels, he doesn't have any heels. And often they throw in, they need them for support. And I've taken to saying, do you ever buy a chair that has longer legs than a different chair because it holds you up better? It's a ridiculous idea that heel length is necessary. Go look at a feral horse. Their heels are practically to the point where the heel bubs are on the ground. Heels are intended by design to be very, very short. So I really doubt that your horse doesn't have any heels.
Well, would you say that the description that she gave with the long toes and no heels, that it might be that the heels are just underrun?
They could be underrun.
And
yeah.
bent under. So the heels are there, but they're forward where they're not supposed to be.
Yep.
So
yeah, Stacy, if you would email me some photos, I would be glad to take a look at those at a different time and give you an opinion about that. But it could also be that there's some thickening of the toe because of bad landings over the years that your farrier is not addressing, that makes the toe look longer than functionally it actually is. There could be stretching of the white line. There's a number of things. And since you mentioned sole, I'm going to throw this out too. One of the other things we hear a lot is he has thin soles. And it's interesting to note that there has been no study linking sole thickness with sensitivity of the horse's foot. Apparently, at some point in time, somebody decided that a particular range of numbers was the right numbers for sole thickness. It does not vary with the breed or size of the foot. In other words, they use that same distance, we'll say 10 millimeters, whether they're looking at a Shetland pony or a draft horse. And obviously, they have different sized every other structure. Why would the sole be the same thickness?
Well, and a horse with shoes on is not going to wear the sole as it should. So it's got a lot of essentially useless sole that's stuck on the bottom. And so when you take an x-ray, it looks like there's a lot of sole there, when in fact, most of that's just flaky tissue that's
junk
down there.
Yeah.
So it gives the impression of a lot more sole. But for a barefoot horse that properly wears its sole, that looks thinner because there's no junk on the bottom of it.
That absolutely correct. So I'm always leery of any of the thin soles things. Now, I will tell you something else about about farriers in their farrier school training. And I had a hard time believing this for a long time until I actually read it in the textbook of the farrier school. Farriers are often taught to pare out the sole until they can just begin to flex the sole with their thumbs. Now, if you think about the logic of that, if I can flex this horse's sole with my thumbs, what does it feel like to the horse when he stands on a rock? It hurts.
Unless his hoof is desensitized because of all the vibrations.
Right, well, yes. This is why when people say, I want my horse to be barefoot, they need to find the right kind of person to make that transition. Right. Here's the scenario that happens if you don't. The farrier says, okay, he pulls the shoes or she pulls the shoes. They trim the sole, including pare it out, like I just said. The horse is sore as heck. The farrier says, your horse is one of those that can't be barefoot, and the shoes go right back on. It's just a vicious cycle. You need the right person to take your horse barefoot. So anyway, I'm happy to look at photos. If you want to send me some photos, I'd be happy to try to advise you on that. So.
Okay, next is Laura. She has 3 questions.
Okay. Thank you.
I think some of them may have been answered already, but I'll just read them out anyway. The first one is, what does bring back the toe mean, technically? I.e., how is it done? How far back? Is there any length of toe? And how is it measured?
Well, bring back the toe means, to me, just about what it sounds like. They cut the toe back towards the back of the horse with the alleged purpose of speeding up breakover or moving the breakover point. According to the work done, the study done by Dr. Hillary Clayton at Michigan State some time ago, none of that stuff affects breakover one bit. She has an interesting paper, called Farriery, What Works, and I think it's just called What Works. And she goes through these various shoe manipulations that farriers do in an attempt to affect things. They don't affect things like people think they do. So we don't recommend backing up the toe. If the farrier or trimmer is trimming your horse correctly, the toe will be the correct length. You don't want to go beyond that point because that means you're violating live tissue, and we don't ever want to do that. And what was the
and because the foot grows down and forward, right? When you trim it to the proper length, the toe moves up and back.
Yeah.
So by trimming it properly, you're taking the toe back, even though you're not chopping it off.
Correct. And it's measured. Toe length is measured down the face of the toe. So if they're measuring toe length, it's from the coronet band. So you would look at the bottom of the foot and find the apex of the frog, the point of the frog, continue that to where it makes contact with the toe, with the wall. And then on the top, that point straight up the tubules to the coronet band, that is the toe length right there.
But it's the wrong thing to really
Yeah,
be looking
you don't
at.
focus on that. It doesn't matter.
Right.
There's some interesting pictures on an Enlightened Equine, one of the articles about just how far back the footprint of the horse moves when you trim it. And I trimmed half a foot. So you can actually see, here's where the foot is now, and here's where it is post-trim. And it's really interesting to see, almost shocking, how far back the footprint of the horse moves.
Okay, question number 2 is, what does bringing the heel back mean? And how is it done, and how is it measured?
I don't think I've ever heard the term bring the heel back.
Some people use that.
I assume...
I think when the heel gets too far forward because the foot grows down and forward, bringing the heel back is, again, trim it properly, and it naturally, as it gets shorter, the heel moves back into place where it should be.
That's all trimming that's done on the bottom of the foot. There's nothing done on the side of the foot or the top of the foot. That's all trimming on the bottom of the foot. As Bruce is saying, merely shortening the foot to its proper length brings the heels back, brings the toe back to their proper location if the trimming is correct.
But some people will bevel the heels where they
Yes, there is a...
or grasp them at an angle rather than taking length off.
Right, that's Dora talking back there.
Sorry.
One of our field instructors and my wife. But yes, there are some people who, for some reason, and I have no data that would support this practice, but they rasp the heel buttresses from the back. They rasp them off at an angle. They bevel them, and I don't know why you would do that. You're reducing the horse's base of support, and and you're moving them forward again, which is what we're trying to avoid. So there's no mechanical advantage to doing that, only disadvantages.
Okay, question number 3. Do you take any sole off, just the hard peeling stuff, or nothing? And why or why not?
Yes, we take off the junk. We like to refer to it as exfoliating the soul, which is just removing the dead junk that nature takes off of the horse in the aboriginal environment. We take off exactly that, no more, and this is equally important, no less. I know there are people out there who like to leave all this junk sole in the foot. They don't believe you should trim the sole. Here's what happens. If you don't trim the sole, eventually that sole is compacted and starts to present a problem and actually makes the horse sore. Why? Well, the horse doesn't know that that's attached to his foot and not a rock on the ground. It's hard and pressing on the foot, the live sole. It's hard and pressing on the live sole. So they get just as sore, just as lame by leaving too much sole on there as they do by cutting too deeply into the tissue.
And once it's compacted, you can sometimes pop it off.
Yeah.
And the actual sole is all bruised underneath.
Oh,
it.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
You've got to take that loose stuff off of the bottom of the foot, the
Yeah.
junk we call
Yeah.
it, you know. And
Yeah.
you've got to get some experience to know how to do that. And
That's a good point. One of the most challenging thing when you're teaching trimming, in my opinion, it's easy to describe the other things, but sole trimming, you've got to feel what that sole tissue feels like with a knife in your hand. There's just no substitute for that as far as I can tell. And until you experience it, you won't know what that's like.
All right, we've got Cindy Watson here.
Oh, no.
If the heel,
hey, Cindy.
if the heel bulb hairline is almost touching the ground, does shortening the toe help to fix this?
No, and there's no reason to do that. Cindy, if you've trimmed the toe properly and the heels properly and the hairline is close to the ground, that's perfectly fine. That's the way many horses are put together. If you look at a feral horse, if you look at a Mustang, if you look at my own horse, my Peruvian Paso, they have quite a bit of slope to their pastern. And so imagine that cone, that foot, instead of being vertical like this or near vertical, it's much more tipped like that. The hairline is much closer to the ground naturally. Nothing wrong with that. There's no data that would suggest that we should do something different because of that. Hopefully that answered your question. Hope you're well.
All right, we've got a Callie here saying, what about long heels as a result of physics and the horse always stretching one foot with the long heels forward to get down to eat? One of my horses does this continuously. How much of the long or underrun heels are a result of his type of physics?
Well, the underrun part shouldn't be happening if your horse is trimmed on a regular basis, correctly trimmed on a regular basis. But yes, you will see differences in the feet. Feet are not pairs necessarily, and that's why it's important that you trim each foot as an individual. There's a thing that's come to be called high-low syndrome, where you have one foot that's at a steeper angle than the other foot. those things are a result of asymmetry in the horse most of the time. Sometimes they're bad trimming, but many times this is because of body asymmetries and asymmetries in movement. And sometimes you have a horse that stands like this all the time to eat. And you can see differences there, yes. You'll know when you're trimming the horse, if you're not trying to make them a matched pair, you'll know if they're trimmed correctly. You'll know if it's really a consequence of this or a consequence of the trimming. By the way, and I ought to throw this in there, most farriers and veterinarians have this exactly backwards. This is cause, that is effect. How I move causes the hoof form down there. I cannot cause proper movement by how I trim. I can cause bad movement if I do a bad job, but I can't change movement to the positive by trimming better than the normal trim that we do, the trim that emulates nature's trim. Cause and effect, not the other way around.
So corrective trimming is not a good idea.
Oh, no. Corrective trimming is a terrible term, and it's very damaging to the horse. I don't know how much you want me to say about that, but in a nutshell, corrective trimming almost always comes down to deliberately unbalancing a foot in an effort to make the horse land on one side of his foot first, the theory being he'll twist the limb around to be straight. Well, it doesn't. First of all, it doesn't work. He may be straighter looking when he's standing on the ground. His legs may look more parallel. But as soon as that leg comes up, it springs back where it was. Why? Because the twist is in his shoulder or his hip. It's not down at the ground. And I can't change at the ground what originates up in the hip or the shoulder. But the bad thing is, a horse can't do this with their foot. They lack this joint, all the joints below the shoulder and the hip, lack the ability to move in any way other than basically a simple hinge. So when you deliberately imbalance the foot to land on the outside of the foot or the inside of the foot, that torque in those directions causes joint damage. Then you end up with ring bone or other forms of arthrosis down there. So you really don't want to try to correct something. It's funny, I met this old saddlebred trainer that I trimmed for a while, and he said, Steve, I finally realized after all these years that if a horse doesn't move the way you want him to move, get rid of him and get one that does. And, that's the truth. You can't fix that. Now, yes, if your horse has body asymmetries, muscular imbalances, that's Dora's area of expertise, Bruce's area of expertise. They can help you with that problem. You can't fix it at the feet.
I have one comment here. It's not a question, but it's a comment, and I think it's nice to mention that Ingrid Nelson says, "So glad I listened to Steve over the vets." I think she visited 2 different vets.
2 or 3 vets, yeah.
For my horse. Problem gone with Steve. I think with the vets, I'd been in a nightmare now.
Thank you, Ingrid. I appreciate that very much. Ingrid has two Mustangs, great horses, Romeo and Flame, and we really enjoy Ingrid and her horses. So, anyway, thank you for that, Ingrid. That's very kind.
She does have a question too. I
Uh-oh.
see that. She says, "I have several friends with racehorses, successful racehorses. The more horses make more money than me." Yep.
We're all in that boat,
Yes.
Ingrid. Yeah.
I would love to hear Steve's comments for educational input about the shoeing of racehorses, knowing their careers are very short.
Well,
And whether that is due to hoof issues.
that their careers are short. I suspect so. There's a couple of things. Now, I'm not a racehorse expert by any means, and I don't pretend to be. But what I do know is that it's, excuse me, they commonly will trim the heels very low and leave the toe longer on racehorses with the idea that as the horse plants the foot and comes over the foot, they're storing more energy, which is true, in that tendon structure, suspensory, so that when they break over, they've got a little more push. And Brian Hampson, Dr. Hampson, pointed out a study to me where they actually confirmed that there was a slight advantage. The risk there is you're going to bow a tendon. You know, you're causing a great deal of strain on the navicular bone and on the deep flexor tendon there by doing that. So it's a dangerous practice. Also, many people don't realize that shoes are actually, a plain shoe is slipperier than a barefoot. So traction can become an issue. But I'm going to finish that, Ingrid, and I hope that answers your question, with an anecdote. Years ago, I had a woman come study with me who was a racehorse trainer. And she had grown up in California. Her father was kind of a horse dealer. He was in the service. And she said they never put shoes on anything. And she moved to the East Coast at some point in her life, became a licensed trainer, and decided she was going to race her horses barefoot. And she said that she heard all these objections. You can't do that. It's cruel, blah, blah, blah. And she said, and then I started winning the races with my horses barefoot. Mm-hmm. And she said, the first race I won, I got back to my barn, and the police and the track stewards are going over my barn with a fine-tooth comb because they were absolutely convinced that the only way a horse could win a race barefoot was if I doped the horse.
Mm-hmm. That's happened a lot, actually.
Oh, has it? Yeah. There's no reason a horse can't race barefoot, and I would like to see them actually have proper trims. But there's other things I'd like to see, which is people not racing 2-year-old horses too.
Well, I mean,
you know,
the truth of the matter is that those horses, they get started very early, mm-hmm. under saddle. They have a fairly rigid training schedule. They spend most of the time, if not all the time, except during training, in a stall. Yeah. They're not with other horses. They experience all of these training, all of these stressors during a critical part of development. And it affects bone density, muscle development, every aspect of the horse's health. And then they break down. Well, what a surprise. Yeah, we shouldn't be shocked by that. No.
Bruce has I remember years ago, I don't know what year that was, 2007 or 8, something. Bruce was up our way for a clinic, and he had some bones from horses. One had died under very stressful conditions, and one had died under normal, end-of-life conditions. Right. And the difference in the weight of these bones is remarkable. The horses that died under stress, the bones had decalcified very quickly, mm-hmm. and they were obviously lighter. So stress, which is Dr. Nock's whole many, many years and many, many, many publications and grants in the area of stress, will attest to. Stress is a horrible, it affects everything.
Yeah. Well, the racing industry went through periods when they had horses that were breaking legs, breaking ankles, etc., and the veterinarians were attributing that to the running surface. And one of them, I forget the name of the horse now, but broke both ankles. It was a famous horse. Was it
Barbaro? No, it wasn't Barbaro. No, sorry,
Barbaro. 2 Bells or something, something like that. And it caused a big row in the horse industry, in the racing industry, and the vets were all making an issue out of the surface. Why I wrote to Oprah Winfrey, and said I would like to come on her show and talk about this, because it's not the surface. It's the stress that weakens the bones of these horses at such a young age. Well, I never got a reply from Oprah.
Darn, Bruce.
I know, what a surprise, right?
Yeah.
But a short time after that, she had a bunch of veterinarians on that were claiming that it was the surface itself that had to be corrected.
What would a veterinarian know about a surface?
Well, I don't know.
Therein lies the problem.
But there are veterinarians now who understand that effect and actually have come out and said it's the whole process that's
Yeah.
causing these horses to break down.
Yeah.
And it came up with all the horses that died out in California.
Del Mar.
At Del Mar.
Yeah. Hope that helps, Ingrid.
All right, we have one more question from Laura saying, do you touch the frog?
Yes, I like to touch frogs. I pick them up and they go ribbit, and sometimes I lick them.
Our cat brings them in.
Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry, Laura. My weird humor. Yes, of course, you have to trim the frog if the frog needs trimming. It's extremely important unless you want a lame horse. We know from the wear pattern and the landing pattern of the feral horses that the frog comes into contact with the ground secondary to the heel buttresses and the area in the toe. If the frog hits the ground first, you will eventually have a sore horse. So it's important that you trim the foot properly to the proper length, and then, if necessary, reduce the size of the frog so that it is just above the heel buttresses. It's not making the first contact with the ground, or you will have a sore horse.
Okay.
Shorter than the heel buttress.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, correct. Yeah, it's always hard when you're,
I know.
it's up, down,
Down,
and
up, there, yeah.
I left this till last because it's a big one and it started a whole discussion here.
Uh-oh.
And
We're gonna have to wrap it up here.
We're running out of light.
Yeah,
Light's really
yeah.
bad. So,
Sorry, folks.
Yeah.
We can always do another one sometime if this is interesting
Just
to
out
you.
of,
Yeah.
what was the gist of it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Recommendations for horses with hoof damage due to Lyme disease. The sole has spread and flattened. I've seen this with other horses that have had Lyme, but only have one with this issue now.
Yes, we actually had a client who didn't have Lyme disease recently, but, well, we have had those too, but had anaplasmosis. And same thing, the sole was flattening, and basically this is that subclinical laminitis I'm talking about. So you have to treat this as if it's laminitis. It is laminitis. So careful management of the stressors, and in this case, the stressor may entirely be the disease.
Right.
So maybe right now you could try to lighten the calorie load on the horse to try to offset the effects of the disease on the foot till you can get through the disease period. Booting the horse when the horse is uncomfortable, not just all the time routinely, but if and when the horse is uncomfortable, would probably be prudent. Beyond that, it's a stressor, and it's not a stressor we can deal with other than treating the disease itself.
Right. Treat the disease.
So, yeah.
And that's a point that a lot of people miss. They go to treat the symptom and,
Yeah,
miss the idea that, no, you have to treat the source, the cause.
Yes. I should have, when I said you can't trim laminitis into a horse, you can't trim laminitis out of a horse either.
Correct. That's
You
correct.
certainly can make them more comfortable with a proper trim, and that needs to happen. It's kind of crucial, but you won't fix the disease. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, just one great one to finish off is, please, when are the new dates available for the UK Gateway Clinic? Oh, it's the UK one. I'm interested to learn more.
Oh, that'd be great.
I posted today that we tentatively have gotten an okay to do the U.S. Gateway Clinic at Ohio State ATI. And that's tentative. We'll get a definitive yes on that the end of March. But in the meantime, we are going to try to get firm dates. My guess it's going to be around the beginning or middle of June, as we usually do. We haven't heard any word. I don't know what the situation is in the UK. I'm hoping that we can return to the UK or some other
somewhere in Europe. Yeah, we hope
in Europe. But we have to settle on that fairly quickly.
Yeah, the logistics, and just this is a good opportunity. I don't know how big our audience is here, but we often have people say, why don't you come up to my place and hold a clinic? Folks, it's pretty complicated to hold a clinic. We have to have a great number of things fall into place properly. The biggest one is we need the availability of cadaver legs, and usually we're talking about a couple hundred or so legs. We're not talking about
Right.
3. We're talking about a couple hundred legs. We need a place to keep them, which means freezers of some kind. You know, ideally, at the university we have a walk-in freezer. That's perfect. We need a place to dispose of them. We need a classroom. We need an environment to trim in. That's probably the easiest one. And then we need housing readily available and not too expensive. We hope.
For the UK and the US clinic, part of the registration fee is housing.
It's housing, yeah.
And also certain meals and transportation to and from the airport. We include
Right.
all of that.
Right.
So
Right.
it's pretty easy for people to do it, but it's not cheap. But
No.
it's also it's very difficult to change sites, and the hardest part is a few years back we did a clinic down at Texas A&M, and we had to actually Ann Corso had to transport the hooves from
Indiana?
upstate Ohio someplace, I think,
Okay.
all the way down to Texas. So she had to rent a van, and we got 2 freezers and put in there. It's a lot to move these clinics.
Yeah, the legs are just crucial to this because we're determined that you have as many legs to work on as you want to work on.
Right.
And so, people may go through a dozen, 15, whatever legs, more than that in that 5 days, and we need those available. It's absolutely crucial to the success of the clinic that you be able to do that. So anyway, just something to keep in mind if you're ever thinking about hosting us. It's not a simple thing, but
Sarah Oliver's here, and she said, I'm watching, I hope you come to the UK next year. So for Suzanne Pearson, just contact Sarah. We don't have a date set yet, she said.
No.
She's asking about
Yeah.
dates.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I need to talk to Sarah and find out what the restrictions are there, and how
we
people
just
are
don't
handling
know.
the
It's all down to COVID.
transportation, and I'm hoping it all disappears by. We
Right.
usually do that now in September there, so by that time I'm
It's
hoping
November,
that it's
yeah.
done. So
And just so you know, the venue in the UK is up in
Cumbria.
in Cumbria, yeah. So way north in the country. And yes, we'd love to see all of you at a clinic sometime. I guarantee you would find it worthwhile, regardless of your goals. You would find it a very interesting experience. So I think we're going to wrap this up here and say goodbye. Thank you all, Dr. Nock.
absolutely, thank you for tuning in, and sorry we were a little bit late, but technical difficulties.